Hello, and thank you for listening to the Bolton Pew Podcast. This podcast brought to you, as always, by the wonderful insider supporters of Protestia Ministries, protestia.com, and related websites, where you can go to find the latest in Christian polemics and discernment news, sign up for the Insurgency email blast, and if you are not already an insider supporter but are considering becoming one, we would very much appreciate the support. You can do that over at patreon.com/Protestia. Starts at $5.95 a month. There are other levels of support. We would encourage you and humbly ask to support us in any way you can. And yeah, that's what keeps this ministry going on the regular. It's what keeps the servers online. That's what keeps us able to offer the meager amount that we offer to the guys that work around here, who honestly are significantly underpaid and do what they do out of the generosity of their hearts. And because it takes so much time, we try to compensate them in any way we can to make sure that it's something they can dedicate their time to. This podcast is done by me in what I like to call Studio C, or in other words, the car. And yes, we do have a Studio A and a B for Protestia as well. Studio B, where the daily news briefs, the intelligence briefings that we do on YouTube, which are right now few and far between, but hoping to ramp them back up sometime shortly. Those are done in Studio B, and then the Protestia Tonight podcast done in Studio A, as well as all the production work and things for other content that we put out. If you're an insider supporter, you'll see some of that content. You'll see funny videos sometimes, worship music, other entries like that, sometimes longer video cuts and things like that will be available to insider supporters. And a lot of that also goes on YouTube as well. So, I mean, if you can go to YouTube, and I have a music playlist on there that has some of this stuff if you haven't seen it before and are so interested. But on this Bully Pew podcast, we're going to be discussing, and by the way, it's been a little while since I put out a podcast. I kind of lost my voice, a combination of allergies and maybe yelling too much at a basketball game. I'm not entirely sure, but it makes it difficult to do a podcast when you don't have a voice. And that voice is returning, and so we're returning to the mic. Also had, some of you insider supporters might have seen a water break in the studio, in Studio A, and so that had to do a lot of sort of removing floor, replacing floor, and things like that. It's almost done. It's getting close because of that water break. So that took up a considerable amount of time as well. But we are back to it. I wanted to discuss in this Bully Pew podcast. I don't want to make it too long, and I got to be careful with this topic. Some of you who read Protestia and are following the sort of news within Reformed church land, within the Reformed community, and Reformed evangelicalism is a pretty small sort of a niche group. We tend to think, but I would argue that certainly what happens around here reverberates throughout broader evangelicalism and broader American culture. And so, I mean, we think it's important. We think it's important that we cover it fairly, that we apply scriptural principles and scriptural principles of justice anytime we're talking about these things. And some of you might have seen recently that we had reported on a couple times at this point. In fact, three times now in total, if you include the latest Julie Roy's article on the issue of the conflict, as it were, long-going conflict at this point that seems to have reached some sort of a conclusion, although I would argue it's not concluded yet. The conflict between St. Andrew's Chapel in Sanford, Florida, the church that R.C. Sproul founded, and related entities, Legionnaire Ministries, Reformation Bible College, the conflict between the church and Steve and Heidi Nichols. Steve Nichols, now formerly the president of Reformation Bible College, the school there, a lead academic of some sort. I don't remember the exact title, but a lead academic of some sort at Legionnaire Ministries. Now not part of either one of those, as far as I understand. His wife, Heidi Nichols, and I almost hesitate to say accusations pointed at now former teaching elder at St. Andrew's Chapel, Stephen Adams. And the church's response to that, the march, of I think it was earlier this month, the announcement of excommunicating the Nichols from fellowship with St. Andrew's Chapel. Of course, they're saying, hey, we already left the church. We're members in good standing of this other Presbyterian church over here. You have no authority over us. So this is all much ado about nothing. And yet, because the information that was, by the written letter intended for the church, but you know how these things go. That stuff becomes corporate in any way, and it's only a matter of time before it becomes public and discussed out in the open and on social media and things. That's just the way that things are. I think, honestly, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. It certainly encourages churches to, in their corporate proceedings, understand that this will be, visible and judged and talked about. So it certainly encourages them to have all their ducks in a row before they do things. But anyway, this excommunication letter is publicized. It results in Steve Nichols releasing a statement in his defense saying, I guess I might have this a little bit out of order. Again, I'm in Studio C. I don't have the documentation right in front of me, but basically there were varying accounts of exactly how all this went down and what the real issues were between Steve Nichols, who framed this as, hey, we got excommunicated, kicked out of the church and things because we reported suspicions of sex abuse of our daughter. He named her. In our reporting so far, I haven't named her. She's an adult now, and Steve actually did name her publicly, so I think we're safe to refer to her by her name. Her name is Grace. She is as far as I know, the youngest and third child of the Nichols, and what we're going to talk about on this Bully Pew podcast is being done, first and foremost out of concern for her. And I think you'll understand why I say that as we get into some of what we know now and what we have learned. Some of this information, for those of you following the story, is probably going to be new information, but it is publicly verifiable information. It is in police reports. It is information that we have no problem vouching for its authenticity. And yet, because there are certainly at the time that this came to light, minors involved, we're not going to be releasing names or trying to identify who these people are. They're going to be protected at least at this stage, and yet the underlying information is essential to understand, I think, why the church acted as it did. Because if you follow the timeline, what you realize, what you recognize is that the church basically brought up on charges ecclesiastically Steve and Heidi Nichols for some of their behavior between when they apparently began to suspect that Stephen Adams had something to do with abuse of their daughter, and July 2025 when they were actually charged with some of this behavior. Again, the Nichols never brought a formal complaint to the church over these things, as far as we know. They certainly never filed a police report. Some of you have seen the body cam footage of the discussion they had with a sheriff's deputy who basically said, yeah, obviously I will take a report here if you want. But I'll tell you, in your interest, a report here will do nothing apart from a primary accusation of the person that's supposedly harmed, apart from details like place and time and circumstances and things. A report that we just talked will trigger an investigation of some sort. At the very least, your names will be on record. It will be clear from the public record that you made a report. Your daughter's name would be redacted from any of that as a minor at the time that these suspicions are occurring. And they didn't want to do it. So they didn't report to authorities. They didn't report to the church the specifics of this. It was only after all of this behavior, after all of this, what Stephen Adams had reported to church leadership. Hey, there's mistreatment going on in the congregation. I'm being called things. I'm being accused of things. There's rumor milling and this kind of stuff going on. He reports this to the church, and only quite a bit later does the church find out that there's any sort of potential sex abuse component to any of this. And at that point, they report to the Department of Child and Family, the Florida's Department of Child and Family, which is basically intakes these kind of things and then forwards them to law enforcement as needed or as warranted, and to the Sanford sheriffs as well. The Seminole County sheriffs. They report theirs. The church reports that as well. But one thing that a lot of people don't know, and I think this is essential, I think, to understanding this, because in order to have an allegation of sex abuse that's taken seriously by law enforcement, it can't be missing all of the pertinent details except for names, right? So you have to have a plausible explanation for, when and how and, under what circumstances and things this supposed sex abuse occurred, in order for a loose suspicion to be something that should be investigated or be palpably adjudicated by any sort of authority. And again, the Nichols had none of this. As far as the evidence indicates, none of this was reported to authorities, and yet in the wake of the church filing a report saying, "Hey, this situation is going on. Here's what we know." As mandatory reporters, now that the sex abuse angle or the sex abuse component has come to our attention, now that we know at least that's sort of part of the discussion, we're reporting to authorities. That's what we're supposed to do. That's what mandatory reporting is all about. Basically notifying the authorities that these things have been told to us. This angle, sex abuse angle, has been reported to us. Therefore, we're reporting to you. Right? This is loosely speaking, without getting into the nitty gritty, what mandatory reporting requirements are all about. In other words, you lose once that's a component of the issue. A non-government authority, like a church or a school or something like this. Obviously, there are public schools as well, but even private schools and things, they lose the option of saying we're going to handle this within our process, within our jurisdictional process. We're going to handle this. Instead, it's got to be reported to authorities because of the time-sensitive nature, because there are minors involved, non-consenting adults involved, and this is I would argue a good and important and normal thing under the understanding of the jurisdictional difference between the church and the magistrate. It's a biblical. We're talking about things that fall squarely under the second table, and fall under the purview of the magistrate as described in Romans 13, 1 Peter 2. This is what they bear the sword to do. It's outside of the realm of the keys-bearing authority of the church, and now into the sword-bearing authority of the magistrate. So the church reports this, and then later they have and again, we're gonna keep this anonymous, but a young lady in the youth group of the church, friends with Grace Nichols, reports to the church that routinely during Wednesday night events at the church, when they have youth choir, they have youth group. The same stuff that a lot of churches do on Wednesday nights. That routinely Grace Nichols would be picked up by somebody and left the church for that time. Not only that, but this young lady reports to the church that Grace told her that that this is when the alleged sex abuse occurred. It was during these Wednesday night times where Grace was not at the church. Now, we have a problem with this because at the time that these reports, this reported behavior occurred while Stephen Nichols was a youth leader. I don't think he was a youth pastor, in terms of an ordained position at that point, but a youth leader, and was very much at the church with everybody else. And yet, like this information would be 100% exonerating, and yet it was never, apparently, whether or not it was known by the Nichols or not, it was never part of their reporting. But it does make me wonder, and I don't think this is stretching. I don't think that asking this question is some sort of out of bounds. But is there a connection between the reason that the Nichols would not actually file a police report, why they didn't actually report the supposed sex abuse nature of this to the church or the civil authorities, either one, and whether or not they knew this information? That question must be asked. It must be figured out. What would be the reasons? Again, this is not overstatement. This is not hyperbole. This is not some sort of like, attacking the victims or attacking the claimants here or something like that. It must be asked because the allegations are out in the open and potentially harmful to somebody that didn't do anything at all. That's Stephen Adams. It has to be asked, why did Steve and Heidi Nichols not file a police report? Why was go and talk to this deputy, try to get a picture with him, say, hey, our church is on our cases for these accusations. We need to be able to demonstrate to the church that the police are looking into this somehow, and yet they refuse to file a police report at that point. Why? I mean, if you really believe that your daughter, she's still a minor at the time that they're talking to the sheriff's deputy. If you really believe that she has been sexually abused, and you believe you know who it is, why wouldn't you file a police report? It makes no sense at all. So we have to at least keep open alternate theories. And now we have it come to light. And again, this is reported to the police that a young lady, a minor in the youth group, friends with Grace Nichols, says she's leaving every Wednesday night. She's leaving every Wednesday night with an unknown person. And she told me that this is when these instances of sex abuse are occurring. And yet, even after this is reported, we still have, people siding with Steve and Heidi Nichols, people currently connected with the PCA, still suggesting this idea that the claim or the suspicion that Stephen Adams was somehow involved in the sex abuse of Grace Nichols is still a valid possibility, when we know it's clearly not. Why is all this being hidden? Why do the people that likely, by any stretch of the imagination, know that this was reported still act, or why are they still playing dumb? It does not make any sense given, the current ways this is being characterized or has been characterized makes no sense given what is actually known, given the fact that there have been no official investigations into this, no law enforcement investigations into this, lack of evidence, loose suspicions do not equal, palpable reason to involve law enforcement or to initiate law enforcement investigation. In other words, there's no probable cause. And so, that's why there's been no investigation. And yet, what we have to ask, and I kind of talked about this at the beginning of the podcast, for the sake of Grace Nichols, everybody's focused on Stephen Adams. Julie Roys and her smear rag, the Roys report, is focused on Stephen Adams and making loose claims about sheriffs investigating, which is just a clever way of reframing a report was given and a sheriff called to ask questions. That's not an investigation per se. That's let's see if there's enough to actually warrant an investigation. But of course, this slop rag, the Roys report, is characterizing it this way. We have to ask, why is everybody focused on Stephen Adams when there's very clear, demonstrable evidence he had nothing to do with anything in even close to this realm? Who are we covering up for is what I want to ask. Because if it's true, if there's truth, and again, this allegation has been reported to police, it's palpable, it's real, that Grace Nichols was leaving with an unnamed person on Wednesday night and that she told her friend this is when sex abuse is happening. If that's true, and we need to find out if it's true, who is this abuser? The focus on Stephen Adams is stopping us from holding whoever potentially abused Grace Nichols to account? Why aren't we focused on this person? Why aren't we trying to figure out who did she leave with? Who picked her up on Wednesday night? Why are we not trying to figure that out? We're focused on a guy who, by any stretch of the imagination and by all available evidence, is not involved in this whatsoever. And yet potentially there's an allegation out there, a claim out there, evidence out there that somebody abused Grace Nichols, and we're not even looking for that person. We're not even asking. Who was this person? Why is there not a police investigation into this? And at this point, there's no police investigation into this because, as far as we know, Grace has been unwilling to actually make these allegations to the authorities. She doesn't want to press something. And so, yeah, we can speculate about why that might be, but I'm more concerned about why Steve and Heidi Nichols are not insisting that this happens. Why they're still pointing the finger at the church for a, quite honestly, irrelevant excommunication letter, given current circumstances. This excommunication letter is, I would argue something that St. Andrew's Chapel should follow through with under their process and whatnot. And yet in reality, it does nothing, because if there's another Presbyterian church willing to accept the Nichols into fellowship in good standing, then it's, whatever St. Andrew's Chapel says about them doesn't matter. So again, we're in a situation where there are no, it's like it offends them maybe, or embarrasses them, or makes them feel bad or something, but it has no actual teeth in terms of anything real. And yet that's the focus, rather than who's the abuser of Grace Nichols. Again, who was picking her up on Wednesday night at youth group? That's what we need to be focused on. Why are Steve and Heidi Nichols busy defending themselves against an excommunication letter that has no teeth at all, doesn't actually do anything, rather than going to the police right now and saying, here's what we know. Here's what's been reported in other police reports. Please investigate this. Find out who abused our daughter. There's something more here, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, it's, you know what they say. I mean, if it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck and walks like a duck, it's a duck. Where there's smoke, there's fire. And when things don't make sense, when motivations don't line up with reality, when what we know and yet what other people are saying don't comport with one another, there's more information that we don't know that can explain these things. There are other motivations at play. Why do Steve and Heidi Nichols not want a law enforcement investigation? Why won't they report? Are there other things? And I'll just throw this out there. I don't have any, like evidence in my hands here or something like that. But is there other things going on with that family we don't know about? Are there reasons why because a law enforcement investigation is going to trigger multiple things, right? They're going to be questioning Grace's siblings. They're going to be questioning Steve and Heidi. They're going to be questioning people that knew them, people that knew them at church, people that were in their lives, other relationships they have. Again, trying to figure out what the reality is around these suspicions of sex abuse of a minor. That's what the authorities should do. That's the right thing to do. So we have to ask ourselves, what other motivation could be at play for not wanting to hold the person who potentially did this to her accountable? That is a completely rational and fair and perfectly understandable position to take and questions to ask. And knowing what we now know about this case, knowing what is coming to light, there's still things that make absolutely no sense. And this is the biggest one. This, I would argue, is the pivot point for everything that we've seen thus far. Not only why there is a preoccupation with again, an irrelevant excommunication letter in terms of present circumstances, a preoccupation with Stephen Adams, a preoccupation with the supposed other things that he did in the past at youth camps and whatnot that just happened to be arising out of a group of former St. Andrew's Church women who are the mothers of these boys. And, I don't know what their relationship is with the Nichols, but it's safe to at least question whether or not they did. You're talking about years go on between the supposed inappropriate conduct and when it's being reported, and it just so happens to be the same time that the Nichols are making unsubstantiated allegations against Stephen Adams. That's not a coincidence, is it? I mean, they don't really expect us to believe that this stuff is just randomly popping up out of nowhere, rather than the much more obvious and clear answer that there's a correlation here. We don't have the evidence at this point to demonstrate causation, like, somehow that Heidi Nichols went and asked for dirt from other mothers who didn't like Adams or didn't like Burke Parsons or didn't like St. Andrew's Chapel. We don't have the evidence of that at this point. But the circumstance, the correlation is too much to ignore. I mean, at least it remains a plausible theory at this point. And then you tack that on with, why won't they just have the authorities investigate? Why won't they bring to bear the authority of the civil magistrate on behalf of protecting their daughter and any other children that might be subject to whoever this is? Again, that was picking up Grace Nichols on Wednesday night, according to witness statements on police reports. Again, this stuff is in the public record. I'm not speculating here. Any open theory that might still explain all of this, that is currently speculative, we want to make sure that we're clear about that. That's speculative. We're not insinuating or trying to claim something that we can't demonstrate. But what we can demonstrate, again, I'll leave you with this before I let you go. What we can demonstrate is that witnesses reported this behavior to the police. They said, somebody's picking up Grace Nichols every Wednesday night, and she's leaving the church and then coming back. And she told a friend of hers that this is the person responsible for sex abuse. And that all happened while everybody knew where Stephen Adams was. He was at youth group. He's helping, he's leading the other kids at youth group while the alleged sex abuse is occurring, according to these witness statements. So why is he the focus of this? Why is his name being dragged through the mud as some sort of potential sex abuser, when not only is there no evidence of it, but the evidence that we do have states exactly the opposite? Why is that being done? That's the question that needs to be answered. Again, why aren't the Nichols demanding a police investigation? Why haven't they filed a police report? Why? There's got to be other reasons here. The church did, by everything that we know, the church, exercised, followed through on their duty to mandatory report when it was found out, that this happened at, that the sex abuse was part of this. They followed through, as far as we know. This, again, they filed a police report. They filed a report with the Department of Child and Family. The Nichols have, and we don't know, by the way, I want to make this clear, we don't know if the Nichols have filed a report with the Department of Child and Family, but so far, such a report, if it's ever happened, did not trigger any sort of law enforcement, activity or investigation. Again, we know that the church filed a report with the Department of Child and Family because the church said so, but those reports are confidential. Like they don't become part of the public record the same way an actual, police report does, a CJIS report, these kinds of things. And a lot of states have this kind of a system where, because they want to encourage people to come forward without fear of reprisal, without fear of being publicly searchable, these kinds of things. And so a lot of states, Colorado's got one as well, they encourage these reports to come through a system that guarantees anonymity for whoever reports it. It's protecting the anonymity of the person that reports it, but then the department, these departments then will look in and see, is there enough information here to forward to law enforcement? Again, this is for the purpose of encouraging people that might otherwise be afraid to say that something bad happened to them, that they've been abused or someone they know has been abused or something. They're afraid of reprisal from that, and this gives them the ability to, basically inform the authorities that something might be here without having to actually be a named accuser, publicly speaking. But again, these reports they're looked into. The people will call these, a Department of Child and Family will call to see, is there more here, before actually opening up a potential investigation. And then again, just like the sheriff's deputy told the Nichols, generally speaking, aside from, palpable witnesses to supposed abusive behavior, these things don't go forward without the person abused being willing to at least say, I was abused. Here's the guy who did it. Here's when it happened, which is all common sense. And unfortunately, we have an abuse incorporated, an abuse, a professional, abuse advocacy class in evangelical Christianity, in Reformed Christianity, that wants the Christian church, wants Christians to adopt an incorporated standard of accusations are valid automatically. You don't need details. You don't need evidence. You don't even need, in this case, apparently you don't even need an accuser particularly. You just need someone nearby that accuser who throws out a suspicion against somebody in order for this to be some sort of evidence of malfeasance by a church. This is the Julie Roy's formula. And she hides behind her I'm a real journalist. But if you actually read her stuff carefully, it's always couched in a way that if what is being said, what's being alleged within her content turns out to be, a total fabrication, it never comes back on her. It comes back on the quote unquote victims of these things. So if provable defamation or falsehoods are forwarded by Roy's, it's always in the form of allegedly, and this person said, and according to this witness statement, and she'll mix up a bunch of that stuff with, what are very standard investigative procedures by law enforcement, but that a lot of people don't know are just par for the course, that don't necessarily indicate anything has actually happened. She'll mix up that stuff with accusations by, supposed victims or their families or things, taken, contextualized to be as damning as possible without actually literally accusing anybody of anything, knowing that the reading public will draw, in their emotional reading of this, will draw the worst conclusion possible. Like, she feels no compunction to actually continue to dig in and then report something in context, balanced with both parties. Under the presumption of innocence, or the presumption that there may be more than one side of the story, she just leaves the other side's story out completely. And yes, legally speaking, she can say, I didn't defame, I didn't report anything false, this is true. Worst case scenario, I just reported a witness statement. And so if it's defamatory, well, you're gonna have to sue the witness instead. So again, far from being an outlet that supposedly is concerned with abuse survivors and victim advocacy, it's an outlet that attacks the church. And if something defamatory happens or something false is said, it comes back on the victims. She's more than willing to use these accusers, people willing to talk to her, as fodder, as human shields for her outlet while she attacks the church. That's exactly what happens. Yeah, you come, let me interview you, and I'll get you to say some really terrible thing. I'll get you to say some things about, this church or this leader or something like that. And then I'll publish them. But of course, if those things wind up being false and defamatory and totally invented, if you want to be in Jussie Smollett, well, that's going to come back on you. I'm protected because I said, hey, according to, according to the victim here, this church leader did yada, 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 yada. Well, if it turns out that's totally made up, Julie's still in the clear because she used the victim here that she interviewed as the fodder, as the human shield, as the person to protect her from legal accountability. And then she has the gall to say that her outlet is somehow about, abuse survivor advocacy and standing up for the victims and this and that and the other. No, she makes them into potential victims by doing it this way. When in reality, if she actually cared about the truth, she would go find out from all sides exactly what happened and make sure that she contextualized things in a way where uneducated readers, people that don't understand the legal process particularly, don't come away with emotional false conclusions. But you and I both know that's not what she does. Anyway, there you go. That's the additional information we have. But my position thus far, knowing what I know, all of this being published evidence, public record evidence, is the questions need to be asked of Stephen Heidi Nichols at this point, not of Stephen Adams. So I hope this information has been helpful to you if you're still paying attention to this, if you're in Presbyterian land, which I'm not, but the concepts of right and wrong and biblical justice are the same between us as Baptists and Presbyterians, and it's important that we lean into that and advocate for it. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Bully Pew Podcast for April 1st. It is April Fool's Day. This is obviously not an April Fool's podcast or anything like that. I don't know. I'm not in the mood for that this year. Who knows? But anyway, stay tuned to Protestia.com, as always, for your latest in Christian polemics and discernment news. Talk to you guys again real soon. As always, Semper Reformanda.